The morning of June 4th, 1942. 10:22 in the morning, Pacific Standard Time. Admiral Raymond Spruance stands motionless on the flag bridge of the USS Enterprise, 200 miles northeast of Midway Atoll. His hands are clasped behind his back, knuckles white with pressure no one can see. The binoculars hang unused around his neck. He is staring at nothing, or rather, at the vast emptiness of the Pacific horizon where somewhere, invisible and perhaps dying, his aircraft are searching for an enemy fleet that may or may not be where he believes it to be. Captain Miles Browning, his chief of staff, has been talking for 3 minutes straight. His voice carries the controlled urgency of a man who knows he is right but cannot make his commander understand why. The words are about fuel consumption rates, search patterns, point-of-no-return calculations, the cold mathematics of aerial warfare that Browning has mastered over years of carrier operations. The subtext is simpler. Recall the dive bombers now, or watch them fall into the ocean one by one when their tanks run dry. Spruance says nothing. He has been in command of Task Force 16 for exactly 9 days. 9 days to prepare for what every man in the Pacific Fleet knows is the most critical naval engagement since Trafalgar. 9 days to learn a job that Admiral William Halsey spent years mastering. 9 days to earn the trust of carrier captains who barely know his name. The question this story must answer is not whether Spruance made the right decision in those 5 minutes. History has already rendered that verdict. The question is what it costs a man to make a decision of that magnitude when he cannot possibly know if he is right. What it feels like to send men to their deaths based on nothing more substantial than instinct, incomplete intelligence, and a feeling about time itself that he cannot articulate even to himself. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This is not a story about naval tactics or strategic brilliance. This is a story about the psychological weight of command at the moment when certainty is impossible and delay means catastrophe. It is about a quiet, cerebral man thrust into a role designed for aggressive warriors, facing the most accomplished naval strike force in the world, making a decision that will either save or doom the entire Pacific campaign. And it is about the 5 minutes he cannot see yet, 5 minutes that exist only as probability and intuition that will determine whether his name enters history as the man who turned the tide of the war, or the admiral who lost the Pacific. To understand what Raymond Spruance was thinking at 10:22 on that June morning, you must first understand what he was not. He was not Bull Halsey. Vice Admiral William Frederick Halsey, Jr. was supposed to be standing on that bridge. Halsey was aggressive, instinctive, loved by every enlisted man in the fleet, with the kind of devotion normally reserved for football coaches or combat infantry commanders. He had been raiding Japanese bases since 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor, striking the Marshall Islands, Wake Island, Marcus Island, hitting hard and pulling back before the enemy could respond. His pilots painted Halsey's heroes on their aircraft. Newspaper correspondents followed him like apostles. When he spoke, which was often, he used words like kill and destroy with evident satisfaction. He was born for carrier warfare the way some men are born for boxing or chess. In late May of 1942, Halsey was in a hospital bed in Pearl Harbor with a severe psoriatic dermatitis that covered much of his body in painful, suppurating lesions. He could barely sleep. He certainly could not command a fleet. On May 28th, Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, visited him in the hospital and asked who should take his place for the upcoming operation. Halsey recommended his cruiser screen commander, Raymond Ames Spruance. Nimitz knew Spruance well. They had been friends for 2 decades. Spruance was a cruiser admiral, a black shoe officer in the surface warfare community, not one of the brown shoe aviators who formed the priesthood of carrier operations. He was known for long silences, for mathematical precision, for an almost pathological aversion to unnecessary risk. During peacetime, while other officers networked and politicked, Spruance spent evenings reading military history. He took long walks alone, thinking through problems with the methodical patience of a chess player. His staff officers respected him, but could not claim to understand him. He rarely explained his reasoning. He simply decided, and his decisions, when examined later, revealed layers of calculation that no one had suspected during the moment of action. He had never commanded carriers in combat. He had been a cruiser division commander during Halsey's raids, shepherding the vulnerable carriers, protecting them from surface attack. Now he would lead them into the decisive battle of the Pacific War, with 9 days of preparation and an enemy force that outnumbered him in every category that mattered. The Japanese were coming with 4 fleet carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Sōryū, and Hiryū. These were not merely ships. They were the tip of the spear that had struck Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. They had ravaged the Philippines, destroyed the British Eastern Fleet at Ceylon, dominated the Pacific and Indian Oceans for 6 months without significant opposition. They carried 248 aircraft, flown by combat veterans with hundreds of hours of experience, men who had trained together for years in a system designed to produce the finest naval aviators in the world. They were commanded by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who had led the Pearl Harbor strike with such devastating efficiency that the American Pacific Fleet was still struggling to recover. Spruance had 3 carriers: Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. Yorktown should not have been there at all. She had been badly damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea 2 weeks earlier, limped back to Pearl Harbor with her flight deck cratered by Japanese bombs, her fuel tanks ruptured, her crew exhausted. Navy planners estimated she needed 3 months of repair work in a proper dry dock. Nimitz gave the shipyard workers 3 days. They worked in continuous shifts, welding, patching, testing, sleeping in 4-hour rotations on the dock itself. When Yorktown sortied on May 30th, she still carried civilian repair crews who would continue working on her damage while she steamed toward battle. Her captain knew she might not survive another major engagement. He sailed anyway. The American numerical disadvantage was clear enough: 3 carriers against 4. Aircraft roughly equal in number but inferior in combat experience, crews hastily trained compared to the Japanese veterans who had been perfecting their trade since China in the mid-30s. But Spruance had one advantage that transformed the entire calculus of the battle. He knew they were coming. Not suspected, not estimated, knew. In the basement of the 14th Naval District Headquarters building in Pearl Harbor, in a concrete room kept deliberately cold to prevent the IBM tabulating machines from overheating, Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team of cryptanalysts had broken the Japanese naval code designated JN-25. They had been working on it since before the war, grinding through intercepts, building probability tables, exploiting the rigid formality of Japanese military communications protocols that made pattern analysis possible. By late May, they could read perhaps 15% of Japanese messages, not complete decryption, but enough to extract critical operational information when combined with traffic analysis, direction finding, and the kind of intuitive cryptographic insight that cannot be taught, only developed through thousands of hours of work. Rochefort's team worked 36-hour shifts. They slept on cots between the machine banks. They subsisted on coffee and sandwiches brought in by wave officers who were not cleared to know what the men in the basement were actually doing. The noise was constant, the clatter of punched card machines, the hum of ventilation systems trying to keep the room below 80 degrees, the scratching of pencils on worksheets covered in kana characters and 5-digit cipher groups. Rochefort himself wore a smoking jacket and slippers in the office, an eccentricity that would have ended his career in peacetime, but which Nimitz tolerated because the intelligence Rochefort produced was changing the course of the war. In late May, the intercepts revealed a major Japanese operation, designated Mai. Traffic analysis indicated a massive concentration of forces: carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, transports carrying invasion troops. The target location was referenced in code as A. Rochefort believed AF was Midway Atoll, but he could not prove it. If he was wrong, if the Japanese were actually heading for Hawaii or the West Coast or the Aleutians, then positioning the American carriers at Midway would leave the actual target defenseless. Rochefort proposed a test. He asked Midway's garrison to send an uncoded radio message reporting that their water distillation plant had broken down. Within 2 days, Japanese intelligence reported that AF was short of fresh water. AF was Midway. The operation was scheduled for early June. The Japanese would strike at dawn on June 4th. Nimitz believed Rochefort completely. He positioned his available carriers, all 3 of them, in ambush northeast of Midway, placed there before the Japanese arrived, waiting in a patrol box that Rochefort's analysis had identified as the optimal position for launch. The Americans would know where the enemy was before the enemy knew where they were. In naval warfare, that advantage was close to decisive. But knowing the future, Spruance was discovering, did not make command easier. It made it vastly more complicated, because now every decision carried the weight of squandered foreknowledge. If you know where the enemy will be and still lose the battle, what does that say about your competence, your courage, your right to command? Intelligence was a gift, but it was also a burden that could crush you if you moved wrong. And Spruance, standing on the flag bridge of Enterprise on the morning of June 4th, was about to discover that the hardest decisions are the ones where you know just enough to understand what hangs in the balance, but not enough to see the outcome before you commit. The battle began to go wrong almost immediately. At 04:30 hours, still dark, Spruance was awakened by his flag lieutenant with the first patrol reports. A PBY Catalina flying boat from Midway had spotted the Japanese carrier force exactly where Rochefort said they would be, 240 miles northwest of Midway, bearing 320 degrees, speed 25 knots, course southeast. 4 carriers confirmed. The geometry was perfect. The Japanese would launch their strike against Midway at dawn, which meant their decks would be temporarily clear while their aircraft were away, which meant this was the moment to hit them, except the moment evaporated as soon as Spruance tried to grasp it. At 0600, the Japanese launched their Midway strike. 36 Nakajima B-5N2 torpedo bombers loaded with 800-kilogram land attack bombs, 36 HED-3A-1 dive bombers, and 36 Zero fighters as escort, 108 aircraft, climbing into the dawn sky in perfect formation, heading for Midway 150 miles to the southeast. The American carriers were still outside their own aircraft's effective range. Spruance would have to close the distance while the Japanese were engaged, then launch his strike before they could recover and rearm their Midway attack group. The timing had to be precise. Launch too early, and his aircraft would not find the target carrier positions were estimated, not known, and a target moving at 25 knots could be miles from its predicted location by the time slow-moving torpedo bombers arrived. Launch too late, and the Japanese would have their aircraft back aboard, rearmed, ready to launch a devastating counterstrike against the American carriers the moment they were located. Spruance needed to be close to 175 miles maximum practical range for a coordinated strike with fighters providing cover. But closing meant pointing the carriers toward the enemy, which meant temporarily suspending air search operations, which meant accepting the risk that Japanese scouts might locate the American carriers before the American strike launched. And carrier combat doctrine, learned through painful experience going back to pre-war exercises, was absolute on one point. The side that struck first usually won. At 0700 hours, Spruance made his first major decision. He would launch immediately everything he had, coordinated strike, fighters, and bombers together. Maximum strength, maximum coordination. By the doctrine, by the book, the correct decision. Except Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, overall task force commander aboard Yorktown, disagreed. Fletcher wanted to wait, hold back, and keep some aircraft in reserve in case additional Japanese carriers appeared that the intelligence had missed. Fletcher had tactical command. Spruance had to wait for his order. The order came at 0745, launch immediately, everything you have. But the delay mattered. At 0806, when the first aircraft from Enterprise began rolling down the flight deck, the range to the Japanese carriers had opened back up to 185 miles beyond the comfortable strike radius, pushing the fuel margins to the edge of safety. And the coordinated strike was already fragmenting before it left the deck. The problem was simple. Different aircraft had different climb rates, different cruise speeds, different combat radii. The doctrine called for all aircraft to rendezvous overhead at 14,000 feet, then proceed to target in a single, coordinated wave fighters high for air superiority, dive bombers coming down from altitude, torpedo bombers approaching low over the water in the final attack run. The three attack vectors would overwhelm the Japanese defenses through sheer simultaneity. The fighters would engage the combat air patrol, the dive bombers would scatter the carriers and damage flight decks, the torpedo bombers, the most vulnerable aircraft in the strike package, would press their attacks during the chaos and confusion. Their torpedoes the weapons most likely to inflict fatal damage on an armoured carrier. But the rendezvous never happened. The F-4F Wildcat fighters, already underpowered compared to the Japanese Zero, consumed fuel at an alarming rate at full military power. The torpedo bombers, slow and wallowing, could not keep up. The dive bombers, with the longest legs and the least vulnerable flight profile, had to choose. Wait for the torpedo bombers and burn fuel circling overhead, or proceed independently and hope the coordination somehow worked out at the target. The squadron commanders made different choices. The Hornets Air Group, led by Commander Stanhope Ring, turned southwest on a heading that would take them toward the Japanese carrier's predicted position. But the Japanese had changed course after launching the Midway strike, turning northeast to close with the American carriers whose presence they had just detected, through their own scout aircraft. Ring led his entire strike group on a heading that would miss the Japanese fleet by dozens of miles. His dive bombers and fighters would search until their fuel ran critically low, then turn back without ever seeing the enemy. Some would make it back to the carrier. Some would ditch in the ocean and be recovered by destroyers. Several would simply run out of fuel and sink with their pilots still strapped in the cockpit, adding their names to the casualty lists without ever engaging the enemy. The Enterprise strike group split apart almost immediately. The dive bombers, led by Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, turned southwest toward the estimated Japanese position. The fighters tried to stay with them but fell behind. The torpedo squadron, VT-6, turned to a more westerly heading based on its commander's estimate of where the Japanese had gone after their course change. The coordination was gone. Each squadron was now operating independently, navigating by dead reckoning toward a target that might or might not be where they expected. The Yorktown strike group launched later, after the Enterprise and Hornet groups were already airborne. This meant better target information. Fletcher's staff had been refining the estimated Japanese position based on continuing scout reports, but it also meant launching into a battle space already chaotic with uncoordinated American attacks. What Spruance could not know, standing on Enterprise's flag bridge at 0900 hours, while the strike groups vanished beyond the horizon, was that coordination was about to stop mattering, because the Japanese defenses were about to do something no one expected. They were about to break under the pressure of sheer, dogged, suicidal American persistence. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the carrier Hornet found the Japanese fleet first. 15. Douglas, TBD, Devastator, torpedo bombers, obsolete aircraft by 1942 standards, slow and poorly. Armed, designed in the mid-1930s, when torpedo tactics called for approach speeds barely faster than a dive bomber and defensive armament consisting of one fixed forward-firing machine gun and one flexible gun in the rear. Cockpit. By mid-1942, the Devastator was a death trap. Everyone knew it. The Navy had a replacement, the Grumman TBF Avenger, already entering production, but production could not accelerate fast enough to re-equip the squadrons before Midway. The men of VT-8 flew obsolete aircraft because they were the only torpedo bombers available. They were led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, a man who prepared for combat with an intensity that bordered on obsessive. He had drilled his squadron endlessly in torpedo attack profiles. He had studied Japanese carrier tactics and defensive doctrines until he could visualize their combat air patrol patterns. He had written letters to his wife before launching, letters to be delivered only if he did, not return. Letters that described exactly what he expected to happen when his squadron found the Japanese carriers. He knew the odds. He pressed the attack anyway. At 0920 hours, VT-8 sighted the Japanese fleet, 4 carriers in a dispersed formation, surrounded by concentric rings of destroyers, cruisers, and battleships, The entire Kido Butai stretched across miles of ocean like pieces on a wargame table. Waldron did not wait for fighter cover that was never coming. He did not circle to coordinate with dive bombers that were searching dozens of miles away. He nosed over into his attack run immediately, 15 aircraft in a shallow descent, heading straight for the nearest carrier, the Sōryū, from the southwest. The Japanese combat air patrol fell on them like wolves. Modern air combat scholarship, examining Japanese action reports and survivor accounts, estimates that the Kido Butai had approximately 40 to 50 Zero fighters on combat air patrol that morning, stacked at various altitudes, coordinated by radio, experienced pilots who had been flying combat missions since China. They had the altitude advantage. They had the speed advantage. They had every advantage except numbers, and 15 obsolete torpedo bombers were not enough numbers to matter. The Zeros came down in successive waves. Waldron's aircraft carried no self-sealing fuel tanks, a weight-saving measure from the late 1930s that seemed reasonable, before combat experience revealed how easily aircraft fuel burned when punctured by incendiary rounds. The first Devastator exploded mid-air when a burst from a Zero's 20mm cannon hit its fuel tank. The second crashed into the ocean, trailing smoke. The third managed to release its torpedo too far from the target to matter, the weapon running true for several thousand yards before its propulsion system exhausted, and it sank before the aircraft itself nosedived into the water. One by one, methodically, the doom of fear, Japanese pilots shot down every aircraft in VT-8. 15 aircraft, 30 pilots and gunners, every single one. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor, ditched his burning aircraft close enough to the Japanese fleet to see the carriers clearly. He inflated his life vest, pulled his seat cushion over his head for camouflage, and floated in the oil-slicked water while the battle raged around him. He would remain there for 30 hours, watching the Japanese carriers burn, watching American dive bombers streak down from altitude, watching destroyers race past his position without seeing him. He would be rescued by a PBY Catalina on June 5th, pulled from the water, sunburned, dehydrated, and traumatized, the only man from his squadron to survive. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise attacked next. 14 aircraft, same profile, same obsolete TBDs, same outcome. They located the Japanese carriers at 0940. The combat air patrol tore them apart before they could reach torpedo release range. Some pilots managed to release their weapons in desperation before their aircraft were destroyed, but the torpedoes ran wild, unguided. No hits. 10 aircraft were shot down. 8 men were killed immediately. 6 more would die in the water before rescue arrived. Torpedo Squadron. 3 from Yorktown attacked at 1000 hours, 12 aircraft. The result was, by now, grimly predictable. The combat air patrol had been refueled and rearmed. The Japanese ships were maneuvering violently, throwing up walls of anti-aircraft fire. The torpedo bombers bored in through a coordinated defense that had now successfully destroyed 3 complete squadrons. 7 aircraft were shot down immediately. 5 managed to release torpedoes. 1 may have hit the carrier Sōryū but failed to detonate, though Japanese records do not confirm this. The remaining 5 aircraft broke off and limped back toward Yorktown, damaged, leaking fuel, and several pilots wounded. By 1000 hours, the American torpedo squadrons had been effectively destroyed as fighting forces. 41 aircraft launched, 35 shot down. Approximately 65 men are dead or dying. 0 confirmed hits on enemy carriers. The Japanese combat air patrol had performed exactly as doctrine predicted. They had maintained air superiority over the fleet. They had destroyed every torpedo attack before weapons release range. They had protected their carriers from the most dangerous threat in carrier warfare, the torpedo, the weapon that could hole a flight deck or rupture fuel tanks or flood machinery spaces, potentially sinking a carrier with a single well-placed hit. They had done everything right, and in doing everything right, they had doomed themselves. Because while the combat air patrol was low on the deck, shredding torpedo bombers, burning ammunition, burning fuel, staying focused on the immediate threat right in front of them, they stopped watching the sky above. And at 10,000 feet, unseen, unengaged, Wade McCluskey's dive bombers were finally finding their target. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, Jr. had a problem that was about to solve itself in the most consequential way imaginable. He had been searching for the Japanese carriers for over an hour. His dive bomber squadron from Enterprise 33 Douglas SBD Dauntless aircraft, the most reliable dive bomber in the American arsenal, had launched at 0800 Fert 6 and flown southwest on the bearing, where intelligence estimated the Japanese fleet would be. They had found an empty ocean. McCluskey had extended his search, burning fuel that he would need for the return flight, gambling that the Japanese were close, somewhere just beyond visual range. His fuel gauges were now reading levels that made the return flight marginal at best. Standard doctrine at this point was clear: turn back, conserve fuel, live to fight another day. McCluskey had already lost contact with his fighter escort. The F-4F Wildcats had turned back when their own fuel reached critical levels. He was alone with his dive bombers, and every minute of continued searching meant one more aircraft that would ditch in the ocean on the return flight when its engine quit from fuel starvation. At 10:15 hours, McCluskey made the decision to turn back. The mission was a failure. The coordination had collapsed. The torpedo bombers had attacked and been destroyed without his dive bombers in position to support them. There was nothing left to do but return to Enterprise and hope enough aircraft made it back to rearm for a second strike. Then his rear gunner saw the wake. A single Japanese destroyer, moving fast, heading northeast, threw up a white rooster tail of water that was visible for miles in the clear morning light. The destroyer was the Arashi, racing to rejoin the main fleet after dropping depth charges on an American submarine that had been shadowing the Japanese carriers. The submarine was the USS Nautilus, which had survived the depth charge attack and would later surface to fire torpedoes at the burning Japanese carriers, none of which would detonate properly, a recurring problem with American torpedo design that would plague the submarine force for another year. But at 10:15 hours, the only thing that mattered was that wake. McCluskey looked at it, looked at his fuel gauges, and made the calculation that would change the war. If a destroyer was racing northeast, it was racing to catch up with something, and that something had to be the carrier fleet. McCluskey turned his formation to follow the wake. His wingmen followed without question. Behind them, climbing to altitude and also searching for the Japanese carriers, was Yorktown's dive bomber squadron, 17 more Dauntless aircraft that had launched later and were now approaching the same area from a slightly different angle. They saw Enterprise's dive bombers and followed. At 10:20 hours, McCluskey's rear gunner saw them. Carriers, 11 o'clock. 4 of them, the entire Kido Butai, spread across the ocean in a loose defensive formation, their flight decks packed with aircraft in various stages of rearming, and McCluskey, looking down from 14,000 feet, could see exactly what condition those flight decks were in. They were chaotic. To understand what McCluskey saw, you must understand what had been happening on those carrier decks for the past hour. Admiral Nagumo had launched his Midway strike at 0600 hours 108 aircraft, carrying land attack bombs designed to crater runways and destroy facilities. The strike had departed on schedule, the aircraft forming up with the precision that characterized Japanese naval aviation, heading southeast toward Midway while the carriers continued their approach. At 0700 hours, the Midway strike commander radioed back that a second attack would be necessary. The first wave had hit the island, inflicted damage, but had not suppressed the defenses enough to ensure a successful invasion. Nagumo needed to prepare a second strike wave, but he had not committed all his aircraft to the Midway attack. Standard carrier doctrine required keeping a substantial reserve armed and ready in case enemy surface forces appeared. That reserve, another 93 aircraft distributed across all 4 carriers, was armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes, weapons designed to destroy ships, not land targets. If Nagumo was going to launch a second strike against Midway, those aircraft needed to be rearmed with land attack bombs. The rearming process was complex and dangerous. Each aircraft had to be struck below to the hangar deck. The existing ordnance had to be removed and stored. New ordnance had to be brought up from the magazines and attached to the hardpoints. Then the aircraft had to be brought back up to the flight deck, respotted, fueled, and prepared for launch. Under ideal conditions, with experienced crews working in peacetime safety protocols, the process took hours. Nagumo ordered the rearming to begin at 07:15 hours. At 07:28 hours, one of his scout aircraft reported contact with American surface forces, 10 ships, apparently enemy, about 200 miles to the northeast. The report was maddeningly vague. What kind of ships? Cruisers? Destroyers? Or carriers? The only American ships that mattered. Nagumo had to make a decision with incomplete information. If those ships included carriers, then his reserve aircraft needed to be armed for ship attack, not land attack. But if they were just cruisers and destroyers screening forces without aviation support, then continuing the Midway strike preparation made sense. And if he stopped the rearming process now, then started it again, when better intelligence arrived, he would waste precious time while his Midway strike force circled overhead, running, low on fuel, waiting to land. He ordered the rearming to continue, armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes removed, land attack bombs being brought up from the magazines. At 0809 hours, the scout aircraft corrected its report. Enemy force, accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. A carrier? The game had changed completely. Nagumo immediately ordered the rearming process reversed. Land attack bombs removed, armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes reattached. But now the hangar decks were cluttered with ordnance in various states of transfer. The land attack bombs that had just been brought up from the magazines were stacked near the hangar deck walls, still waiting to be loaded. The armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes that had been removed were scattered across the hangar deck, some already in the process of being struck back down to the magazines, some still sitting on carts. And there was no time to properly store the ordnance, because at 0830 hours, the first American attack arrived Midway-based Marine Corps aircraft, obsolete F-2A Buffalo fighters and SBD Dauntless dive bombers, flown by pilots with minimal carrier attack training. They pressed their attacks with desperate courage and were slaughtered by the combat air patrol without scoring a single hit. But they disrupted flight operations. They forced the carriers to maneuver. They consumed time. Then came the B-17 flying fortresses from Midway, bombing from 20,000 feet, missing by hundreds of yards. The high-altitude bombing doctrine proving utterly ineffective against maneuvering ships. But more time is consumed, more disruption. Then the torpedo bombers, VT-8 at 0920, VT-6 at 0940, VT-3 at 1000 hours. Wave after wave of obsolete, slow aircraft boring in at low altitude, forcing the combat air patrol to focus downward, forcing the carriers to maneuver violently to avoid torpedoes, forcing Nagumo to delay the landing of his Midway strike force because you cannot recover aircraft while simultaneously engaging in radical evasive maneuvers. By 10:20 hours, the flight decks of all 4 carriers were packed with aircraft. Some were from the Midway strike force that had finally been allowed to land aircraft that needed to be refueled and rearmed immediately if they were going to be useful for a counterstrike against the American carriers. Some were from the reserve that had been rearmed twice now, currently configured for ship attack with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, but still spotted incorrectly because there had been no time to properly arrange them for launch. Fuel lines snaked across the flight decks, connecting the refueling pumps to aircraft that could not wait. Ordnance was scattered, some properly stowed, some sitting on carts, some stacked near the island superstructures because the hangar decks below were already full. The carriers were vulnerable in a way they had never been vulnerable before. Every safety protocol had been compressed or bypassed. The ordnance that should have been in the magazines was exposed on the hangar decks. The fuel that should have been pumped slowly under careful supervision was being pumped as fast as the systems allowed. The aircraft that should have been properly spotted for either defense or offense were crammed wherever space existed. And at 10:22 hours, Wade McCluskey looked down from 14,000 feet and saw all of it spread out below him like a targeting exercise. He did not radio his intentions back to Enterprise. There was no time, and maintaining radio silence prevented the Japanese from detecting his approach. He did not wait for Yorktown's dive bombers to coordinate the attack. There was no time for that either. The Japanese lookouts would spot his formation within minutes, possibly seconds. He did not set up a proper attack approach vector. There was only one thing to do. He nosed over. Emergency dive, full, power. 37 dive bombers in 2 groups, 5 miles apart, arriving at almost exactly the same moment by pure chance. The Japanese lookouts spotted them at 10:26 hours and 30 seconds. Air raid sirens began wailing. The Combat Air Patrol, low on the deck after shredding the torpedo bomber attacks, tried to climb to intercept. Some fighters made it to altitude, most did not. The anti-aircraft guns opened fire, throwing up walls of flak, black bursts of explosive that looked terrifying, but were largely ineffective against aircraft already in their terminal dive, plummeting straight down at speeds approaching 300 miles per hour. The first bomb hit the carrier Akagi at 10:26 hours and 45 seconds. A 1,000-pound armor-piercing bomb released from a Dauntless, flown by Lieutenant Richard Best, Enterprise's bombing squadron commander, struck just aft of the midship elevator. The bomb punched through the flight deck, detonated in the upper hangar, deck directly among the aircraft that were being rearmed, igniting aviation fuel and setting off the ordnance that was still scattered across the hangar space. Secondary explosions followed within seconds. Torpedoes cooked off, bombs detonated. The fires spread forward and aft, consuming everything flammable, reaching temperatures that buckled steel bulkheads and ignited paint off the overhead. The carrier Kaga took 4 hits in rapid succession. The first bomb struck near the bridge, destroying the command structure and killing most of the senior officers immediately. The second and third bombs hit the flight deck near the stern, penetrating to the hangar deck and igniting the same catastrophic chain of secondary explosions. The fourth bomb hit the forward elevator, blowing it completely off its mounting and sending it cartwheeling through the air before it splashed into the ocean. The carrier Sōryū took 3 bombs, all within seconds of each other. 2 hit amidships, 1 near the bow. The pattern was identical penetration through the flight deck, detonation in the hangar spaces, secondary explosions as stored ordnance ignited. Within 20 minutes, Sōryū would be a floating inferno, abandoned by her crew, dead in the water. 3 carriers mortally wounded in approximately 5 minutes. The fourth carrier, Hiryū, was positioned several miles away from the others, far enough that McCluskey's dive bombers did not see her during their approach, focused as they were on the 3 carriers directly below. Hiryū would survive long enough to launch 2 strikes against the American carriers that afternoon, crippling Yorktown with bomb and torpedo hits that would eventually sink her. But American dive bombers would find Hiryū at 1700 hours and put 4 bombs into her flight deck, leaving all 4 Japanese carriers burning or sunk by the end of the day. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The battle was effectively over. Japan had lost offensive capability in the Central Pacific. The remaining Japanese forces, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, the invasion transports carrying troops meant for Midway, would turn and withdraw without accomplishing their mission. The turning point of the Pacific War had occurred in 5 minutes of dive bombing that succeeded only because 3 squadrons of torpedo bombers had sacrificed themselves to pull the Japanese defenses down to sea level. But at 10:30 hours, standing on the flag bridge of the Enterprise, Admiral Raymond Spruance did not know any of this yet. The first radio reports began arriving at 10:35 hours. Akagi hit and burned. Kaga on fire. Massive secondary explosions observed. Sōryū died in the water. Heavy smoke. The radio operators repeated the messages, their voices professionally controlled, but unable to completely hide the shock of what they were reporting. Staff officers crowded around the radio shack, trying to process information that seemed too good to be true. 3 carriers hit, 3 Japanese fleet carriers knocked out in a single attack. It seemed impossible. Carrier combat doctrine, based on years of exercises and the limited combat experience from Coral Sea, suggested that carrier battles were attritional slugfests, where both sides traded damage over multiple strikes. Decisive results in a single attack wave happened in peacetime exercises with generous umpire rulings, not in actual combat against the most experienced carrier force in the world. Captain Browning was staring at the message logs, recalculating everything he thought he understood about carrier warfare. Spruance, standing at his usual position by the forward windscreen, set down his binoculars carefully. His hands were shaking, the only outward sign of the tension that had been building since the launch decision 3 hours earlier. He clasped them, behind his back, the knuckles white with pressure. An ensign approached and asked if they should prepare a second strike. Enterprise still had reserve aircraft, and the Japanese fleet was clearly vulnerable. Spruance thought about it for a long moment, staring at the horizon where the battle was occurring beyond visual range. Then he shook his head. No second strike. Not yet. Recover the aircraft that were already airborne. Assess the damage. Confirm the intelligence. Make certain this was not some elaborate confusion or misidentification. And most importantly, locate the fourth carrier because the intelligence said 4 carriers, and only 3 had been hit, which meant somewhere out there was a fully functional Japanese fleet carrier with a complete strike capability, and until that carrier was located and neutralized, the battle was not won. It was the right decision, characterized by the caution that defined Spruance's command style. But it also revealed the psychological, the reality of command at this level. Even with 3 enemy carriers burning, even with victory apparently within grasp, uncertainty still dominated every calculation. You could not afford to believe your own success until it was confirmed multiple times through multiple channels. You could not assume the enemy was beaten until you had accounted for every threat. The moment you relaxed, the moment you assumed victory, was the moment the enemy would hit you with something you had not anticipated. The strike aircraft began returning at 1100 hours. They came back in 1s and 2s, scattered across the sky, some trailing smoke, some barely maintaining altitude, most critically low on fuel. The carriers turned into the wind and began recovery operations, the controlled chaos of landing dozens of aircraft in rapid succession, arresting cables, catching tailhooks, aircraft handlers pushing planes forward to clear the deck for the next landing, fuel crews and ordnance crews swarming over each aircraft the moment it stopped rolling. Wade McCluskey landed on Enterprise with 6 gallons of fuel remaining in his tanks, barely enough for 5 more minutes of flight. Several other pilots landed with less. 3 aircraft ditched near the task force when their engines quit final approach, the pilots rescued by destroyers. 2 aircraft crashed on deck when their damaged landing gear collapsed. 1 pilot died when his aircraft hit the carrier's ramp and exploded, unable to maintain altitude on his final approach. The debriefings were chaotic. Pilots were exhausted, traumatized by what they had seen, struggling to provide accurate counts and damage assessments while their hands still shook from adrenaline. But the pattern was clear. 3 Japanese carriers hit hard, burning, probably not capable of launching or recovering aircraft. Status of the 4th carrier unknown. The torpedo squadrons had been destroyed. VT-8 completely wiped out, VT-6 nearly destroyed, VT-3 badly damaged. Total torpedo bomber losses: 35 aircraft, approximately 65 men dead or missing. The price of those 5 minutes was starting to become clear. Admiral Nagumo stood on the bridge of the light cruiser Nagara, watching his flagship Akagi burn. He had transferred his flag from Akagi when the fires became uncontrollable, the carrier's damage control teams unable to suppress the multiple blazes spreading through the hangar decks. The transfer had been humiliating, climbing down rope ladders while his command burned behind him, boarding a destroyer that pulled alongside long enough for him and his staff to jump across, then transferring again to Nagara when it became clear that commanding the remaining Japanese forces from a destroyer was impractical. From Nagara's bridge, he could see all 3 burning carriers. Akagi, listing slightly to port, smoke pouring from her hangar deck openings and the holes blown through her flight deck. Kaga, burning, even more fiercely, occasional secondary explosions still rippling through her structure as ordnance continued to cook off. Sōryū, already abandoned, floating dead in the water, her entire superstructure engulfed in flames. The 4th carrier, Hiryū, was still operational. She had launched strikes against the American carriers that afternoon and had scored hits on Yorktown confirmed hits, the kind of damage that should cripple an enemy carrier. But Hiryū was alone now, facing 3 American carriers, and Nagumo knew what was coming. The Americans would find her. They would hit her with the same kind of massed dive bomber attack that had destroyed the others. and she would burn just like Akagi was burning now. Nagumo's chief of staff was asking questions about withdrawal plans, about rallying the remaining surface forces, about whether the invasion of Midway could proceed with only land-based air support. Nagumo was not answering. He was watching Akagi burn and thinking about December 7th, 1941, when this same carrier had launched aircraft against Pearl Harbor, 6 months ago. Had it only been 6 months? At 1700 hours, the reports came in. Hiryū under attack, multiple dive bombers, hits confirmed, fires out of control, 4 fleet carriers, the entire Kido Butai, gone in a single day. Nagumo would survive the battle. He would be reassigned to shore commands, eventually taking responsibility for the defense of Saipan in 1944. When Saipan fell to American forces, Nagumo would commit suicide, unable to bear the shame of another defeat. But that would come later. On June 4, 1942, standing on Nagara's bridge, watching his command burn, Nagumo was simply trying to understand how everything had gone so catastrophically wrong. The answer was complex, involving intelligence failures and tactical decisions, and the simple bad luck of American dive bombers arriving at the exact moment when Japanese defenses were vulnerable. But there was also something simpler, something that would obsess Japanese naval analysts for years after the war. The Americans had kept coming. They had lost their torpedo squadrons completely destroyed, shot down to the last aircraft, and they had kept coming. The dive bombers had kept searching even after they should have turned back, kept pressing even when fuel margins became critical, kept attacking even when they knew the cost. Japanese doctrine assumed rational decision-making. It assumed commanders would conserve forces when situations became untenable. It assumed that after losing 35 torpedo bombers without scoring a single hit, the Americans would withdraw, regroup, and try again another day with better coordination and better tactics. The Americans had not done any of that. They had pressed attacks that should not have been pressed. They had continued searching past the point where searching made sense. They had made decisions based not on rational calculation, but on a kind of dogged, irrational determination that Japanese planning had not accounted for. And a quiet cruiser admiral named Raymond Spruance, thrust into command just 9 days before the battle, had somehow understood exactly when to commit, exactly how much risk to accept, exactly when to trust that his dive bombers would find the target, even when every mathematical calculation said they would not. The full scope of the victory would not become clear for hours. Yorktown would be hit by Japanese aircraft from Hiryū that afternoon, 2 bombs and 2 torpedoes that would leave her dead in the water, listing heavily, abandoned by most of her crew. She would remain afloat through June 5th, and salvage crews would reboard her with hopes of towing her back to Pearl Harbor. But on June 6th, the Japanese submarine I-168 would find her and put 2 more torpedoes into her hull. She would finally sink on June 7th, taking the destroyer. Haman down with her when Haman, tied alongside, providing power and pumping support, was caught by the same torpedo spread. The 4 Japanese carriers would all be scuttled or sink from their damage. Akagi would be torpedoed by Japanese destroyers early on June 5th, after her crew abandoned her, the fires having burned out of control through the night. Kaga would sink on her own late on June 4th, capsizing and going down after her structural integrity failed. Sōryū would sink on June 4th at 19:13 hours, exploding violently as she went under. Hiryū would burn through the night of June 4th and be scuttled by Japanese destroyers on the morning of June 5th. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, 248 aircraft, and 3,057 men. America lost 1 carrier, 145 aircraft, and 307 men. But the real loss for Japan was not measurable in ships or aircraft. It was the combat-experienced air crews, the pilots, and gunners and bombardiers who had trained together for years, who had formed the core of Japanese naval aviation, who could not be replaced in any time frame that mattered. Japan would build new carriers. They would produce new aircraft. But the men who had flown from China to Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean to Midway, the cadre of veterans who made Japanese naval aviation the finest in the world, died at Midway. Some died in the attacks on the American carriers. Some died when their carriers sank beneath them. Some died in the water waiting for rescue that never came because Japanese destroyers, under orders to withdraw at high speed to avoid American submarine attacks, could not stop to pick up survivors. After Midway, Japan would fight on for 3 more years. They would win tactical victories. They would inflict grievous casualties, but they would never again achieve the strategic offensive capability they had possessed on June 3, 1942. The initiative had passed to the Americans, and it would never return. Raymond Spruance would go on to command at the Marianas, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. He would end the war as commander, 5th Fleet, one of the 2 most powerful naval forces ever assembled, alternating command with Admiral Halsey's 3rd Fleet, in a rotation designed to allow continuous offensive operations while staff officers rested and planned. He would plan the invasions that broke Japan's defensive perimeter. He would develop the carrier task force doctrine that dominated the final 2 years of the Pacific War. He would become, in the estimation of many historians, the finest naval commander America produced during World War II. But he never gave dramatic speeches. He never raised his voice in anger. His staff continued to call him the Quiet Warrior, a nickname that captured both his temperament and his effectiveness. When asked about Midway in later years, he was always careful with his language. "I made decisions based on incomplete information," he said in a 1963 interview for the Naval War College. Many of those decisions could have been wrong. Some of them probably were wrong, but the consequences did not reveal it. I do not claim special insight or tactical brilliance. I had good intelligence, good staff officers, and extraordinarily brave pilots who executed their missions under impossible circumstances. Source: Naval War College Review, Volume 16, Spring 1964, Interview with Admiral Spruance. His staff officers remembered it differently. Captain Browning, who argued with him on the morning of June 4th about recalling the dive bombers, wrote in his private memoir, "He felt something. I cannot describe it more precisely than that. He knew not through intelligence reports or mathematical calculation, but through some instinct I did not possess that our aircraft would find the Japanese carriers, and that they would find them at the right moment. I argued with him based on fuel consumption and probability curves. He listened politely and did not change his decision. It was the most important decision of the Pacific War, and he made it based on a feeling he could not articulate even to himself." Source: Browning. Miles. Staff Impressions from the Pacific War. Unpublished manuscript, Naval War College Archives, 1958. What Spruance understood, what separated him from commanders who might have been more aggressive or more cautious, was that warfare at the strategic level was not about eliminating uncertainty. It was about acting decisively while uncertainty remained overwhelming. It was about absorbing information from every available source, processing it through experience and doctrine and instinct, and then committing to a decision that could not be proven correct until after the consequences had already occurred. He did not need certainty. He needed probability tilted slightly in his favor, and the courage to commit when probability suggested but could not guarantee success. On the morning of June 4, 1942, at 10:22 hours, standing on the flag bridge of the Enterprise while his chief of staff argued for recalling the dive bombers, Spruance made a decision that saved the Pacific campaign. Not because he knew he was right, but because he was willing to be wrong and willing to bear the weight of that possibility while men died carrying out his orders. That is what command means at the highest level. Not omniscience, not tactical brilliance, but the capacity to decide when a decision is impossible and to live with the consequences regardless of outcome. There is a memorial at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, dedicated to the pilots who died at Midway. The names are engraved in bronze. The men of VT-8, VT-6, VT-3, the dive bomber pilots who ditched when their fuel ran out, the fighter pilots shot down trying to protect aircraft they could not reach in time, 41 torpedo bomber pilots. Their average age was 23 years old. Verified. Midway Memorial, Naval War College, Newport, Rhode Island. He commanded the carrier escort Corregidor in 1944 and retired as a rear admiral in 1956. In his oral history interview, recorded in 1966, he described the moment he saw the Japanese carriers spread out below him. "I knew we had them. I knew if we pressed the attack immediately, without coordinating, without setting up properly, we would catch them with their defenses disorganized. I also knew some of my pilots would not make it back because we had extended the search beyond our fuel margins. But this was the moment. If we did not attack right then, the moment would pass and we would not get another chance. So we attacked." Source: McCluskey, C. Wade. Oral History Interview, Columbia University Oral History Research Office, 1966. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor from VT-8, spent 30 hours floating in the Pacific, hiding under his seat cushion while the battle concluded around him. He was rescued on June 5, returned to flight status in August, and flew combat missions through the rest of the war. In his memoir, Sole Survivor, published in 1979, he wrote, "I think about my squadron every day. All of them are gone. And I ask myself, what did they accomplish? They did not hit anything. They did not damage the Japanese fleet. They were slaughtered before they could release their torpedoes. But Admiral Spruance told me, years later, that they accomplished exactly what needed to be accomplished. They pulled the Japanese defenses down. They disrupted the carrier operations. They created the conditions for the dive bombers to succeed. 15 men died to create 5 minutes of vulnerability. That was their mission, whether they knew it or not. And they succeeded." Source: Gay, George. Sole Survivor, A Marine's Story of Midway. Midway Publishers, 1979, p. 187. Admiral Nimitz, in his official report to the Secretary of the Navy dated June 28, 1942, concluded, "The Battle of Midway represents the tactical and strategic turning point of the Pacific War. Enemy offensive capability has been decisively reduced. The initiative now rests with American forces. Credit for this victory belongs to the pilots and aircrew who pressed attacks under impossible conditions, and to Admiral Spruance, whose judgment and tactical decisions were instrumental in achieving this result." Verified. SINCPAC Report. Action of 4th June 1942. National Archives Record Group, 38. But Nimitz also noted, in a private letter to his wife, written on June 10th, "Raymond did something remarkable at Midway. He made decisions that another commander might not have made. He trusted his aircraft to find the enemy when all evidence suggested they would not. He committed to attacks that appeared to be failing, and continued to commit even as losses mounted. There is something about his temperament, his ability to absorb terrible information without flinching, to maintain his course despite uncertainty, that makes him uniquely suited for this kind of warfare. Bull Halsey is more aggressive, more instinctive, more loved by the men. But I am not certain Halsey would have won at Midway. Raymond won because he was willing to watch men die while he waited for a moment that might never come. That is a burden very few men can bear." Source: Potter, E.B. Nimitz. Naval Institute Press, 1976, p. 94. Letter quoted from Nimitz's personal papers. The question that haunts military historians, the question that generates endless analysis and counterfactual speculation, is this. What if Spruance had listened to Captain Browning? What if he had recalled the dive bombers at 10-15 hours? The Trey aircraft would have returned safely. The fuel margins would have been adequate. The losses from the torpedo bomber attacks would have been just as catastrophic. 35 aircraft destroyed, 65 men killed, but at least the dive bombers would have survived to strike another day. And the Japanese carriers, with 15 more minutes to sort out their flight deck operations, would have launched their strike against the American carriers sometime between 10:45 and 1100 hours. Approximately 90 aircraft dive bombers and torpedo bombers with fighter escort, flown by combat veterans, navigating with the precision that characterized Japanese naval aviation, they would have found Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown still recovering their own aircraft, flight decks crowded, defenses disorganized. The strikes would have hit hard. How hard is speculation? But the Battle of the Coral Sea provides a reference. The Japanese strike on Lexington sank that carrier with multiple bomb and torpedo hits. The strike on Yorktown at Coral Sea caused severe damage that took weeks to repair. A strike of 90 aircraft against 3 carriers, even with American combat air patrol and anti-aircraft fire, would have inflicted devastating damage. Best case, 1 American carrier sunk, 2 damaged badly enough to require withdrawal from combat. Worst case, all 3 carriers sunk or crippled beyond repair. The Japanese would have retained 3 or possibly all 4 of their carriers. The material balance in the Pacific would have shifted decisively in Japan's favor. Hawaii would have become untenable as an advanced base. The carrier losses would have made it impossible to defend the islands against a determined Japanese offensive. Australia would have been isolated, possibly invaded. The timetable for Allied offensive operations would have been delayed by years, and the atomic bombs, when they became available in 1945, would have been employed against a Japan that still controlled most of the Pacific, still maintained its offensive naval capability, still believed it could achieve a negotiated peace that preserved some territorial gains. The war would have lasted longer. Casualties, both military and civilian, would have been exponentially higher. The post-war world would have looked fundamentally different. All of that was prevented by one man's decision to trust his instinct about 5 minutes that had not happened yet. That is the weight of command. That is what it means to lead at the strategic level, not knowing the future, but deciding anyway. Not eliminating uncertainty, but committing despite it. Not avoiding the burden of sending men to their deaths, but bearing that burden while maintaining the judgment necessary to make the next decision, and the next, and the next, until the battle is won or lost and history renders its verdict. Raymond Spruance bore that weight. He made the decision. He did not flinch while men died. He waited for 5 minutes he could not see, could not prove would arrive, could not guarantee it would matter even if they did. And in those 5 minutes, the entire Pacific War pivoted, not because of tactical brilliance or superior technology or overwhelming force, but because one quiet, cerebral man, thrust into a role designed for aggressive warriors, understood something fundamental about warfare that cannot be taught in any classroom or learned from any manual. He understood that sometimes the only thing you can do is trust the mathematics you cannot prove, commit to the decision you cannot defend, and bear the weight of uncertainty while history unfolds around you. That is the command. That is Midway. That is what it cost Raymond Spruance to stand on that bridge at 10:22 on the morning of June 4, 1942, and refuse to recall his dive bombers, even as every rational calculation suggested he should. He was right, but he could not have known he was right until after the bombs fell. And that the willingness to be catastrophically wrong, the courage to commit anyway, the capacity to bear the weight of other men's deaths, while you wait to discover if your instinct was sound, that is what changed the world. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.